it wasn't that long ago that you really couldn't do this on your own. As a business owner, the thought of going out and buying a server, setting up Active Directory, deploying Exchange, deploying SharePoint, figuring out how to network all of your workstations and set up user identities, it was very daunting. And cloud services and cloud SaaS have really democratized this.
You are listening to the Mindful Business Security Show, brought to you by Fosivity, where we answer your questions and simplify information security for small businesses. Get the clarity you need to focus on the things that matter.
Well, hello. Welcome back. I'm Accidental CISO, and this is the Mindful Business Security Show. I can't think of any business that doesn't have a need for email, productivity, and collaboration tools of some sort. Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace are the two giant gorillas in that space, at least when it comes to cloud apps. And today we're going to talk about what small business owners and leaders should know about securing their M365 and Google Workspace environments. If you aren't already subscribed to the show, I'd like to extend a personal invitation to you. You can find us in just about every podcast app. My guest today is another longtime industry veteran. Thankfully, that hasn't made him too grumpy yet. For over 20 years now, he's worked in roles from IT help desk to IT director, as well as from engineer to consultant to technical sales in the managed service provider space. He's the founder of Conflux Cloud, a consulting and managed services firm focused on cloud infrastructure and cloud security for small businesses. He loves animals and has rescued or adopted a wider than average variety of critters over the years. Welcome to the show, Anthony Peyton.
Thanks so much for the intro. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on. We've known each other for actually quite some time in the industry. When I was running IT and security departments at more than one company now, I've actually had you in your company in to do work for me in the past. So it's great to get to collaborate on this. We've had kind of a long professional relationship up to this point, and this is just another opportunity to collaborate. So I love it.
It's been great. We've done some fun stuff. Unfortunately, I don't think we can talk about any of it because it's all under NDA.
I hate it when that happens. As somebody who's had a lot of interesting pets over the years, uh, my dad just always kept bringing more creatures home. And he's always the one saying, no more pets. And then he was always the next person to bring a pet home or some sort of animal into the house. I'd love to hear a little more about the animals that you've rescued over the years and just wonder if there's one that stands out as maybe the most interesting or exotic type of creature that you've rescued or adopted.
Yeah, you're right. I've had a huge array of pets. About the only pet that I haven't kept is cats, and that's because me and most of my family are nearly deathly allergic to them. So if it's not a cat, I've probably had it. And the most interesting one, this is always a difficult question for me because so many of the pets that I've had have been interesting in so many ways. But I think that I've got to start back near the beginning of my exotic animal journey and talk about really the first exotic animal that entered me and my family's life. And it was when I was in high school growing up in Kettering, Ohio. One of the science teachers had a classroom pet that was a full grown green iguana. When I say full grown, this thing's body was a little over 5 feet with a tail that was a little bit longer than that. So this was a very large animal. Now, the problem with this thing being in a classroom is, in Kettering, we did not have year-round school. So during the summer, it couldn't just be left in the school alone. And so for 2 years running, my family had agreed to take this iguana home and pet sit it over the summer while school was out. And at the end of the second year, the science teacher reached out to us and said, "Hey, I've got to ask you this." And he said, I hate to ask, but I don't know what else to do. Said the school has decided that this pet is too much of a liability to have in the classroom, that there's just too much risk. And I can completely understand where the school system would have come from. If you've ever had a green iguana, you know that there are a variety of concerns around keeping them. They're actually pets that I don't advise most people keep. The only ones that I've ever had have been ones that I've adopted or rescued. Um, and any animal that large has a capacity to be dangerous. And iguanas are really not animals that ever become what I would call fully tame. And so they go through breeding cycles, they become aggressive, they've got very sharp claws, very sharp teeth and powerful jaws, and a tail that, I mean, especially when you're thinking about children, could break bone. So you can understand, I think, how the school system maybe might not have thought that this was a great thing to just have around. And they're also escape artists. They're really good at finding their way out because they're both intelligent and strong. They are really good at finding ways out of whatever enclosure you try to contain them in. So her name was Ziggy, and we kept her um, for many years. She ultimately landed in another home, but it's what started our whole exotic animal journey. And throughout all of that, we had all kinds of other very interesting animals. We had geckos, bearded dragons. At one point, we had a veiled chameleon, which is another pet, by the way, that I really don't recommend that anybody keep. They're extremely delicate and sensitive. They can actually get stressed out and die from being looked at too much. And just a lot of people don't realize that because they're really cool looking pets, but they're just very sensitive. But bearded dragons are great if you're looking to get into exotic animals. Bearded dragons are fantastic pets. They're easy to take care of. They're omnivores, so you can feed them a wide variety of food from fruits, vegetables, crickets, mealworms, or if you can stomach it, dubia roaches. Most people are not too cool about bringing home a box of roaches and throwing in their pets' habitat, but it's a bunch of cool animals. And I've also had snakes. At one point, I had two red-eared sliders. I was watching one for my brother, and I was halfway home for another one that was a pet from a coworker's child that they couldn't deal with it. Turtles are a lot of work because the water gets super gross. So yeah, I've had a huge variety, but right now we're down to just a couple dogs, and we have a Chinese Shar and a black lab.
Nice. Oh, I love labs. I love labs. I had a couple of those over the years too. So yeah, we had several lizards so my dad had a pair of tegu lizards very briefly. Uh, they weren't nearly as big as the iguana, but they turned out to be very spiteful creatures. They were not friendly at all, and my dad decided, kind of like your school district did, that this is a liability. I We can't keep these, and was able to find another home for them. Let's shift gears just a little bit here and jump over to the topic at hand with securing cloud environments for things like Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. Something that's very common is for small businesses, they'll sign up for a cloud service, Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, or virtually any other SaaS service out there. And there's this expectation that the SaaS provider is going to be responsible for the security and the availability of the service. And I think that generally is a fair expectation. But then there's this unspoken expectation that the cloud provider is also responsible for the business's data. I'm curious if you've seen that as well, and if you have, is that justified, or is that something that maybe needs reframed for business owners as they're looking at adopting cloud services?
It's a great question. And this is something that's really difficult, both for business owners, business people, but also even tech people who are familiar with operating on-premise infrastructure, where you have, full responsibility essentially for everything. When you pivot into cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, there's a governing contract that is really important to be aware of called the shared responsibility model. This is something that every cloud provider is going to have to some degree. But what's interesting is that there's no real agreed upon standard of what this shared responsibility model looks like. And so, because of that, it's important to understand what the shared responsibility model for your service looks like. These are easy to find. All the cloud providers put them out there publicly. And if you do a search for, say, Microsoft 365 shared responsibility model, theirs specifically is a little confusing because they don't publish a distinctly separate shared responsibility model between Azure and Microsoft 365. They have one shared responsibility model that they publish for all of their cloud services. So when you look at that, it requires a little bit of thought about what services you're using and how you're using them. But they do a really good job at breaking down where they sit in infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, what they are. Google is, I feel like they do a little bit better job in being more granular in their shared responsibility model. And of course, AWS has one out there as well. I think the AWS was the first one to really coin that term, and the term caught on as an industry standard. I would say that the shared responsibility models presented between AWS and Microsoft 365 and Azure are very similar. The Google one is a little bit different and better in some ways, in my opinion. But it's really important to understand those, and then to really dive into what that means for you as a business and what responsibilities you have to cover. And so you brought up 2 points in the beginning of this. One of them was about the security of the service. And security is always going to be a shared responsibility. So you're going to have some security that is the responsibility of the service provider, where they're going to be responsible for securing their infrastructure, securing physical access, securing access to the data. But there are some security tasks that, as a business owner or an IT person, you're going to be responsible for as well. And that's going to be the security of your data controls and your user identities. So your user identities are something that no matter what level of that stack you're in are always your responsibility. The data is also always your responsibility. I've yet to see a shared responsibility model where the service provider takes responsibility for the data, and that includes backing the data up. Now, that can be a challenge because some service providers give you really good access via API to back your data up, and some don't. We could probably sit here all night and talk about differences between specific service providers, but it gets really hairy really quickly. And ultimately, you just have to go and understand what your provider does, where that presents gaps in your strategy, and what actions you need to take to protect yourself and protect your data.
And it is so important to understand with these cloud services, where do my responsibilities start and end, and where do the vendor's responsibilities start and end with this? And it's so easy, especially with backups, to think, oh, yeah, I use Microsoft 365, they're my backup. Yes, Microsoft does backup data, but they're not backing up at the level that you could call them up and say, "Hey, I accidentally deleted this file. I need you to restore it for me." Like, they're backing up data at the level, like, something happens in the platform and they need to globally restore services, and those types of things. And even then, you don't necessarily have a guarantee that whatever happens, that they're going to fully be able to restore your data up to that point that the issue happened. Maybe they're only able to go and restore to several hours before, whenever the last, backup, system level backup or whatever was taken that included your data. So yeah, very, very, very important.
Absolutely. And at the risk of getting too far down in the weeds, I'll just put a final point on that, that there's a variety of mechanisms that become important to understand, specifically when you're thinking about backup, because the backup, in the sense that they're doing it, is that they're going to have replication between data centers, but that's really for availability, not for recovery. And
Yeah.
certainly they have some level of snapshots. But if you look at this objectively and you think about how much data Microsoft has to have just in Microsoft 365, thinking about your organization and the amount of data that you have in OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, Power Platform, etc., and then multiply that times every Microsoft 365 customer, think about even attempting to back that data up at scale. It becomes nearly impossible. And that's where it becomes the responsibility of each customer.
It is mind-boggling. And a lot of organizations that use these platforms, like, they don't have internal IT folks or security folks. And the business owner often then is the administrator. And they're obviously focused on running the business. They're not focused on checking the admin portals and running this stuff. Like, so it becomes a set and forget sort of thing. I've set up my Microsoft 365, my Google Workspace, my emails are created, we created the user accounts, like, we're using it. I'm good. Are there things that folks who administer these platforms for their businesses, like, should be doing from a process standpoint or maybe be checking on, periodically in the platforms just to make sure that, like, they're not just completely neglecting things once they get it initially set up, or is this something that they can expect it, like, once they get it set, they're mostly pretty good?
Yeah, this is another really interesting question because the answer has changed over time. If you would have asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have told you that the platforms in the state that you buy them are nowhere close to secure by default or set it or forget it. Fortunately, that's gotten a lot better, both on Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. The default configurations from a security perspective have gotten a lot better. But one thing that I always encourage people to keep in mind is that these products are designed to service a wide array of businesses and a wide array of use cases. And that means that these service providers are going to develop them in a way that's going to mostly work out of the box for most people with minimal support incidents. And that means that in some cases, there are going to be security settings that are probably not optimal for you or your industry or your business that just aren't turned on by default because they could cause problems with some customers and generate support incidents, which is ultimately going to be one of their key goals because that's going to be one of, other than storing the data, that's going to be one of the biggest costs that the cloud providers incur is that they have to support this. And most of these SaaS products include support. You don't generally have to pay extra for support with them, which means that that's cost that they're carrying. And so, in both environments, there are some things to look at. In Microsoft 365, there's a setting called security defaults. Depending upon when you bought Microsoft 365, it could be on or off. And for very small businesses that don't have IT staff, I generally advise them to turn this on. Now, you may find that it breaks things because it's a binary switch for a bunch of security settings. And so maybe test it at a point where your business isn't super busy or you're in the middle of a critical process or transaction period. Turn it on, see what happens, check with the people in your business and make sure nothing broke. But if it's acceptable to you, it is a very good starting point. On the other hand, Google, I will say, generally comes out of the box in a little bit better state than Microsoft. The default settings for Google are typically pretty solid, and they're doing some things. Both them and Microsoft are both moving the needle forward with turning settings on by default that protect things like administrators with multi-factor authentication and protect users. They're both actively rolling out changes and have actively rolled out changes that make that secure by default. But that said, both providers do have some good resources for you to use. If you look up an article on the Google Workspace side. It's called Security Checklist for Small Businesses, 1 to 100 users. This gives you a lot of really good things to look at. And just it's a really common sense checklist of things that you should do. And I would say that you should review something like this at least once a year and make sure that it hasn't changed or that you're still aligned, that you haven't regressed. On the Microsoft side, inside their platform, they have what's called the Secure Score. And you can use the Secure Score to benchmark the configuration in your tenant against their recommendations. One thing to note is that when you go in there, the secure score is going to give you recommendations for things that you don't have the licenses to do. That's okay. You can filter those out and ignore them until those licenses come into play, but it still may be good to look at them and understand the intent of what they're trying to do there and how you could construct business processes that might help you mitigate that risk.
Makes a lot of sense. You mentioned, uh, breaking things. You do this at a time that, maybe you don't have like some, huge project in flight or something, and obviously small businesses, like, always have something, going on, and that sort of brings me to something else I wanted to talk about. These admin portals in these platforms, they're pretty complicated because there's a lot of settings in there, and it's not always super intuitive or user friendly, especially for somebody that isn't a career IT admin. And, even for myself as that career IT administrator, I run into occasions where, like, I'm afraid to change or enable a setting because I'm not exactly sure what it does or how it's going to behave. And so I have to go research that, make sure I understand it, and then come back. But, like, doing that research is difficult to expect somebody who's not a career IT professional to do. Like when you're a business owner who's focused on running your business, not being an IT person, you know, have you come across any features that are particular confusing or like counterintuitive in the way they're presented in the admin interface or the way they function that are worth calling out? Because if somebody's listening to this and thinking, "Oh, I want to go look and see how my security stuff are set," like, are there any that you want to like highlight specifically for listeners that might go do that and be like, "Hey, there be dragons. Beware of these things."
For the most part, the portals are, I will admit, they're definitely confusing. They were written for people with a technical background. Um, there aren't a lot of really scary buttons, that you can use to nuke yourself nowadays. The warnings have gotten better and the descriptions have gotten better. One of the things that you can do if you wanna get a deeper understanding of what the settings affect, and I'll admit this, the way these are written can be pretty techy, but it's very verbose and it will help you gain an understanding. Is if you go out to the Center for Internet Security and download the baselines or the fundamentals, depending upon what part of the product stack you're looking at. If you're looking high level at Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, there will be a baseline for both. It'll be called fundamentals, and then certain products will have very specific baselines. But within all of those, they go through each setting in a lot of detail, usually around a page. And you can read through those. It's one, it's a very good central source for information. And two, it does a very good job of breaking down exactly what each setting does and what changes can be made to affect that setting.
Okay, perfect. That'll be really useful. Well, I'll work with you to get links for those, and we'll put them in the show description because I think some of the stuff that we talk about in this, there'll probably be more links to come. We'll do the same thing there. Anthony, I know you've worked with a lot of clients over the years. Like, are there certain mistakes that we haven't talked about yet that you see small businesses consistently making when it comes to like how they're approaching cloud adoption?
Interestingly, one of the mistakes that I've seen, and this is kind of specific to Microsoft 365, is sometimes people will go too far with security without understanding the impact or without working with the business to understand what the effect of this change is. And so I'll give you one example that's really, really easy to explain and really clear. In Microsoft 365, in the SharePoint Admin Center, there is a section where you can control the default sharing activity and what levels of sharing are allowed. I have found some people tend to do that are very well intentioned is they look at this and they look at this slider and they say, "Well, I don't want anyone outside the organization to have access to my data." And so they will set it to the least permissive setting. The side effect of that is then that you have your internal business users that have put all their data in Microsoft 365. They need to collaborate with people outside of the organization, but they're not able to create things like sharing links or add people as guests to be able to access it. And the unintended impact of this is that then your users will revert to attaching documents as file attachments, or even worse, using third party services that aren't under your control. Sometimes we call this shadow IT, such as, Box.com or Dropbox, and they'll put files in a personal account or a personal Google Drive and share it out. And now that business data has permanently left the boundary of your control. And most small businesses don't have the ability to deploy things like CASB, where they can control what services their users are able to get to when they're accessing corporate data. That can be really hard for a small business to do. So what you want to do is find a balance where it's both your data is secure and also at the same time your users have the ability to use it to collaborate with people outside of the organization easily.
Yeah, the business context is always really important.
Yeah. We have to be careful that we don't end up like Mordak, the preventer of information security from the Dilbert cartoon, where the final step of the login process is to stare directly into the sun for 30 seconds. We have to make these things usable to the people who we're paying to do jobs and paying to grow our business.
Absolutely. And lastly here before we move on to caller questions. If you had a magic wand and you could wave this magic wand in the air and just instantly have every small business owner know and understand something about cloud security, what would that one thing be?
It's hard to pick one thing. But if I had to pick one thing, I think I'm going to flash back to the beginning of what I said. And that is, if I could just impart one core piece of knowledge into every business owner's mind, it would be a clear understanding of the shared responsibility model. Just because when you understand that, it becomes so clear what your responsibilities are. And that is the foundation of building a proper security plan around any piece of cloud software.
Excellent. Great thoughts on that. So we've got some callers here waiting on the line, ready to ask their questions. You ready to go and take questions and give them some answers?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's go.
Do the cybersecurity risks to your business have you confused? Visit Focivity.com/podcast. That's FOCIVITY.com/podcast and sign up to be a caller on a future episode.
So, our first question this episode is actually a mailbag question. This is from Nesters. Nesters is a member of the Small Bets community that I'm a part of. It's a group of entrepreneurs and business owners online. And when I was asking if folks had questions for the episode, his question was, why do I have to secure the cloud? And I know this is a bit tongue in cheek, but I'm sort of interpreting this as like, why do we even need to have this conversation? Should this even be a problem in the first place anymore?
It's a good question and definitely a sentiment that is in everybody's minds, right? If I paid all this money to go to the cloud, why do I have to secure it? Wasn't that one of the selling points? And the short answer is yes, that was one of the selling points. And you did gain some security, but also one of the trade-offs that we've realized over time in cloud infrastructure and cloud services, as we've migrated more workloads from on-prem to cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service or software as a service, is that with that centralization came a little bit more obvious attack surface. So when everybody was running their own workloads and they were all in their own data centers, it took a lot more effort to go find out where things were. When you're in Microsoft 365, the attack surface is obvious. It's the same for everybody. When you're in Google Workspace, everybody knows how to get to google.com. Every threat actor in the world knows where that is. And so there's a little more focus that's required here to make sure that your security is up to speed because those threats are real. They're out there and they are targeting small businesses. They're targeting these cloud platforms. And sometimes they don't even care what size of business you are. They're out there just looking for accounts that can be compromised in those known things. It's relatively easy to figure out if your business is using Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. There's some telltale signs. We're not going to go into all those details, but it just suffice to say it's really easy to figure out. And so once you figure that out, then it's really easy to, as a threat actor, say, well, they can go look at the same documentation that you can, right? And so when they look at what the default settings are and they know what the gaps are, then they know what to attack by default. And it's really important for businesses to secure every aspect that they can because of how public knowledge that is, right? As opposed to running your own software on prem, there's a lot more entropy in the configuration and the attack surface is a lot less clear from a 50,000-foot overview.
And we talk about business context as well. And these tools are made to meet the needs of lots of different businesses that have lots of different use cases. And with that flexibility, comes the need to be able to configure these things. And one organization may have very different needs in how they're going to use these tools than another. They may have different security needs as well, different risk profiles based on the type of business they're in and uh, the things that they do, the services that they offer, products that they offer, those types of things, just size, eh, all of that stuff. And it all does come down to, you know, one size fits most sort of thing. You buy the hat or something. It says one size fits all, and it doesn't actually fit anybody well. Uh, I think this is having to do some stuff with security really comes down to the trade off that Microsoft doesn't know exactly what everybody's use cases are going to be. It's that 80/20 rule that you were talking about earlier. Um, that you just it's the nature of the beast, I suppose, that to get that flexibility.
If there's a silver bullet that Microsoft could deploy to make every tenant secure from the overwhelming majority of all attacks, you can bet that they would deploy it. It just unfortunately doesn't work that way. And it gets so granular so quickly, even something that you might not think about. For example, at Conflux, we're a small team and we're all here in the United States. So it's easy for me to make a decision and say, I'm not going to allow anyone to access or sign into my services from outside the US. But that might not work for you. You might have digital nomads that work for you that travel around Southeast Asia. You might have a key employee in London or in Melbourne. And so, that those are it would be easy for Microsoft to say, well, you deploy this in North America, we're only going to accept logins from North America, but it's not that simple. Each business is unique in their requirements, and their security
Yep.
solution has to be tailored.
All right, so our first caller on the show today is Patrick from Peoria, Arizona. Patrick, welcome to the show. How can we help you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm currently leading a volunteer organization. We're one of the best kept secrets of the United States Air Force. No, not Area 51, but it's actually called the Air Force Auxiliary or the Civil Air Patrol. Dates back to pre-World War II. And we are adult volunteers who perform missions for the Department of Defense and state and local agencies, but we're also volunteering with kids ages 12 to 21, building tomorrow's leaders, focusing on citizenship and leadership, but also a lot of aerospace education that includes information security. So I myself coach our Cyber Patriot, cybersecurity competition team every year. We have IT people and security people as volunteers, but they're all volunteering doing other parts of the mission. And as you can imagine, they're very busy with their day jobs already. So my challenge is that, we inherit infrastructure from the leaders before us, and our current infrastructure is Google Workspace, G Suite. And so we're using mail, calendar, Google Meet occasionally, and a lot of files, drives, docs. And, with that inheritance, everything of value either lives in Workspace or it lives in one of the web apps that our parent organization, the Civil Air Patrol, hosts for us. My concern is twofold. One, the best way to secure the workspace, and the second is we have a bunch of PCs and laptops in the building. How do we secure those so that they don't become a threat to the workspace environment and protect people who kind of wander into the building to do other things for us or with us? So those are my questions.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks for the question. And so I'll start out with just a little bit of a statement that one thing that Google Workspace, in my opinion, does a little bit better than the Microsoft stack, and that is that their products are a lot less segmented. If you've worked with Microsoft 365, you know that they have a maddening number of SKUs, and that functionality is really split at a micro level across that. And so with Google Workspace, I'm not certain exactly which plan you have, but as long as you're in the that business standard, business plus, or business standard, the and even between that and starter, there's not a huge difference from my understanding about the security features. And I don't know if you've seen it, but and I mentioned it earlier, and this will be in the show notes, and I'll make sure a copy of it gets over to you. Google actually has a checklist, a security checklist for small and medium business users. And interestingly, they bifurcate it. So they have a 1 to 100 and a 100 plus. I would recommend looking through that. But all of your standard stuff is going to apply. So you're going to want to make sure that you do things like use dedicated admin accounts, make sure that all accounts have multi-factor authentication. There's, going to be some obvious exceptions if you have service accounts and whatnot. Another thing that I see a lot of businesses miss on, and this is advised in both platforms, is to make sure that you have an emergency access account. And I would make sure that this account is as independent from an individual user as possible. Have at least one, maybe two emergency access accounts, and set those up with a FIDO2 key, like a YubiKey or similar, so that it's not dependent upon somebody's phone or phone number to be able to sign in. Ideally, none of us are using SMS based multi factor authentication, but I know in the real world, there's still some of it out there. I would do those things at a minimum. And then once you get that, you can just continue to work on the maturity of your security implementation. Make sure that you're using least privilege for administrators. It sounds like in your environment, you probably don't have an army of admins, but in some organizations that size, you might have multiple people that are administrators. And in that case, you would want to consider somebody's job role and aligning their job role to the level of access that you give them as an administrator. And then also thinking about that from a user perspective of, does everybody need access to everything, right? How do we start to segment things up and only give permission to things that people need? In Google Workspace, this can be a really tedious process because Google Workspace was built to be very highly collaborative. It was built for all data just to be kind of stuck in Drive and easily searchable. And sometimes that might mean that you're going to go through the effort to identify sensitive data and put it in what's Google has a thing called sites that's kind of similar to SharePoint, where you can set up dedicated spots for data and put your identity boundaries around those, only give access to certain people. You can do it in Drive as well, where you can set up, shared Drive locations and only grant access to certain people. But in Google Workspace, it requires a lot of rethinking the platform because a lot of people buy Google Workspace because it's so easy to get working right out of the box. And then it grows and the data sprawls and you just end up with a lot of data that everybody has access to, and that was concerning enough when everybody could just search. Obviously, no discussion in 2025 is going to be complete without talking about AI. And so now that Google has made Gemini available to all Google Workspace SKUs, this becomes even more important because now people can not only search for data, but they can just ask Gemini, and Gemini is going to go find whatever they have access to and return that data in results from natural language searches. So it's really important to take the effort to go through it and do that, but also go through that checklist. There's a lot of great recommendations. I'm not going to go through the whole list because it would be boring and take a lot of time, but I would highly recommend that you look at it. And Google does a really good job at tiering that out. I would start with the one for small businesses, 1 to 100, and use that as your foundation, and then progress on to the one that's 100 plus because those are going to be more advanced and they may reference licensing that you don't have access to if you don't have the business plus or enterprise SKU.
Got it. Yes. Yeah. We also looked at the managed Google Chrome since most of our apps are web based, and deploying that on the free tier as well. So there's another option there that we're considering. But again, that looks like it requires a small army of administrators that we don't have. Well, I have 15 to 18-year-olds that I've trained that could possibly turn loose on that, but I'm not sure about the wisdom of that.
Managed browsers, if you can ever do them, are great. Google Chrome is a great option if you're in the Google Workspace ecosystem. If you're not, there's other options out there on the marketplace.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
With small businesses, especially, and this may not be necessarily for your particular situation, Patrick, but for small business owners, if you've had one of these environments that have been operating for several years and you're starting to think about this now, uh, going through these checklists is good. But it might also be worth having somebody come in, have a professional come in, and it's not terribly expensive to do this, but have a professional come in and do a cloud security assessment and just check your configs, just make sure things are set, especially if that's been there for a while and you may think it's configured one way but it's not, like you may have some drift in actual configuration between where you think it is. And so I think that's something that a lot of small business owners could benefit from, uh, especially if they're inheriting an environment or again starting to focus on security of an environment that's been going for a while, is have an assessment done of that, because then that professional can give you good recommendations about your specific use cases, how you're using the platform in your business, maybe even tie a little bit to some of your business processes through, conversations they have with you, and help you figure out where is the right place to set these sliders, so to speak, on how strict do we want certain rules to be. So
Since we are basically cloud first, cloud native, but we have on-prem laptops, desktops that really don't leave the building, um, do we just throw a Windows Server license with Active Directory at it, or is there a FOSS, open source or a cloud-based tool? Again, remembering zero budget in our org, that we can, we can't afford to pay for a 200 user license for really anything. So, is the answer to securing local devices that belong to us? Is it still pretty much Active Directory?
At your size, I would resist that.
I want to.
Unless you really just want Active Directory, I would resist it. There are other tools that are good at the job. Um, with Google Workspace, and it's going to be the same for Microsoft 365, you're not going to get robust device management unless you pay for their top tier. But you could at least use them as your source of truth for your identity. And one of the superpowers that Google Workspace has is you can kind of work around this and get a lot of it for free just by using sign in with Google to your other cloud apps.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
thanks, Patrick. Appreciate you coming on the show. Our next caller on the show is Greg from Southern California. Welcome to the show, Greg. How can we help you?
I'm a virtual CIO. So I work with a lot of companies, and I'm used to working with companies that have both internal IT, external MSPs, and then a little bit of executives that love to tweak some things. So in turn, here's the question: what affordable tools would you recommend to evaluate and monitor cloud security configurations? More specifically, how can we create an early warning system for critical misconfigurations in either our M365 or Google Workspace environments? I'm really looking at Wiz here, obviously big player, cloud configuration, but of course enterprise budget with it. So how can we make sure that when someone turns the dial in the wrong direction, that we realize that that dial was turned in the wrong direction?
It's a great question. The key word that I picked up on in your question was affordable. The the problem with affordable is that it's relative, not absolute. So what's affordable to me might not be affordable to you. And so I'm going to talk about a variety of tools, and I'm going to shy away a little bit from price because pricing is going to vary depending upon who you are, how you buy it, and who you buy it from. But as far as what tools you can be using to assess that and put in place, there are a lot of good ones. If you are in the Microsoft 365 environment and you're hardcore bought in on Microsoft and you want to stay in the ecosystem as much as possible, Sentinel is always an option. I'm not going to comment on the affordability of Sentinel. I think that is what it is, but its biggest benefit is that it's there. One of the other things that you can look at in Microsoft 365 is they have a bunch of built-in alert policies, and a lot of those policies do cover configuration changes or admin events, such as, hey, an admin logged in and did a message trace or started an e-discovery search. Those are things that you would typically want to know about because they could be indicative of someone going rogue or maybe digging into data that they shouldn't really be looking into. You should be reviewing those things as well as configuration changes. There's also a lot of products out there that will do it. You mentioned Wiz. Wiz is great. If you can afford Wiz, buy Wiz. If you can't, there are other options out there. I know that Upwind is another good one that is, I believe, not as expensive as Wiz. Um, Both Wiz and Upwind are going to be um, more or less sledgehammers if you're just looking at a productivity solution. Typically, those are solutions that people are going to get if they're also trying to look at larger cloud environments, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service in Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS. If you're really just trying to monitor those, it might be worth the effort to go look into some other ones. There's also CyberCube, which is an option. And AvePoint is another good option. They're the key option that I'm aware of that can cover both Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. So I would look at those tools or a combination of them. There's also a lot of options out there for SIM source and XDR products that you could look at. I'm a big fan personally of Blue Mira. Their solution is a little, again, more focused on M365. They may tie into Google Workspace, but it's definitely not a focus of theirs. There's probably a better alternative for GWS shops out there. Um, if you're spunky and you can run your own Elastic stack, then you could also deploy Wuzza. Wuzza's free and open source. So the good news is that it's free. The bad news is that you really better know what you're doing if you try to deploy it, because it's pretty complex. The guides are great, and most people can stumble through it. But again, you got to be careful that you're not creating additional attack surface by running an open source Elastic stack out there. You got to be careful where you put it, how open it is, and just understand what that means.
Wearing my CISO hat, just from what you described of the situation, it sounds like you've got a lot of different people in different roles who are able to affect changes in the system that may have varying degrees of respect for the process and the policies that are in place for that. Um, and that is a cultural issue that may be harder to change here because that one's got to start at the top. And from your description, it sounds like the executives are part of this problem. So some of this is going to be cultural change from the top with executives kind of reevaluating the policies that are in place around who should and shouldn't have access to be able to make these kinds of changes. And it's difficult, especially in small business organizations, because people were able, everybody's got to wear a lot of hats, everybody's be able to do a lot of things. And it's like, well, you don't trust me to make the change. It's less about trust and more about making sure that one, things are in a known state, but also that when things go wrong, that it protects them at the same time because now something went wrong. But if they didn't have access to make that change, nobody can think that they broke something. Or if somebody gets access to their account, some attacker, that reduces that risk surface. And so this is one of those areas where, especially in small orgs, I'm a huge, huge proponent, especially in small orgs. And a lot of times people, well, we're so small, we don't need to go this far. Having separate admin accounts from daily user accounts is really, really important.
Every single time, period, without hesitation.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. There is no org that is so small that they don't need dedicated admin accounts. And at the risk of being a little redundant, because we talked about this a little bit on the last question with Patrick, but yeah, absolutely, everyone needs dedicated admin accounts. You should also have at least one, if not two, emergency access accounts that are very separate from any user identity. Get a couple FIDO2 keys, set them up with that. Put monitoring around those accounts. Know for sure every time they are logged into those accounts. Like they should only be used for emergencies, and if they are ever logged into, every alarm bell you've got should be going off.
But I think, as well as the technical stuff, there's some people pieces to this problem that may have to back up and have some heart-to-heart conversations with senior leadership. And this may take some work to get some buy-in from folks, but senior leadership to maybe change some of the ideas and some of that the culture there too, to get folks to let go of being able to make changes to these systems, especially if they're not somebody whose day-to-day job is supposed to do that. And this could even include like IT directors and stuff who are in that middle ground where like they've recently been the technical person, but now they're into a management role. If their job day to day isn't to do those things, maybe some leadership coaching with them too about letting go may help them let their teams handle these things and stay out of it themselves. Because the more you get up the chain, the less likely those folks are going to be to follow the process, make sure things are documented completely because they're busy and there's a lot going on. And I'm just making this quick change. Uh, so I think that's one of the challenges is you're going to have is there's definitely a people side of this, and a technology side of this. So.
From we talked earlier about the tooling to detect changes and to make sure that we don't have any critical misconfigurations in our cloud environments. We talked about some options there. Thank you very much, Anthony. But when changes are made, what change management process would you recommend for these cloud configuration changes, especially in these shared responsibility environments of internal IT, external providers? Of course, they're going to have like IT tickets, but an IT ticket is not a change management system. It's a ticketing system. And at what thresholds should we design this for so that it doesn't create undue burden on the whole entire organization, doesn't become a real drag?
This is probably a good question for you, as more of the CISO, where I tend to be a little bit more tactical in my role.
Yeah. I think when it comes to change control, part of it is what we were talking about with culture and making sure that folks are actually going to, honor the processes. Because whatever process you put in place, if people refuse to follow that, now we have an HR problem. It's not a technology problem. Uh, but with change control, and especially in small organizations, it can be very burdensome very, very quickly. So I try to, when I'm working with small business clients, help them define lightweight change control processes. And the types of things that we can do there may not necessarily be the things that are going to work in a much larger organization. So in small organizations, like I try to stay away from processes where we have change advisory boards, where getting a change pushed through requires getting multiple people into a room at the same time to coordinate. And now somebody's absence can block a change that may need to move quickly. So to try to keep things moving quickly, we try to work with the appropriate levels of escalation and approvals. Uh, and part of that ends up being change classifications and looking at what are the types of changes we need to make day to day, and having maybe routine changes are defined a certain way that don't require as strict of approvals, because these are things that a help desk request comes in, somebody needs something, it's a minor, can you add me to a distribution list or something? And that can be, there can be logic around that distribution list so they can go and do what they need to do, and it doesn't require escalation up to management necessarily. Maybe some types of changes can be pre-approved based on certain logic that the person verifies, yep, those met those things, and they can mark it in the ticket. The change is done, and they've approved it, and they can make that change. And then maybe some other types of changes do need to go up through manager approval, or something like that. And in software dev shops, because I know you mentioned software developers and stuff, I like to have processes where different functions each have a voice in the process. So and you can facilitate a lot of this with automation. And so that's another huge thing with small orgs, especially, is by putting some effort into the automation. So the system facilitates the process, and the process is the easy way and the right way. You keep people from getting creative and going around it. And you may have the developers, they have a voice through a code review and a pull request merge. Somebody on that team has code, they've submitted it, and then another person on the team, they do their review, and a different person merges it. So now you've got some separation of duties there, another set of eyes. That function has their voice in the change process. And then maybe the QA group has a voice in it through their approvals, and maybe there's a business acceptance testing. But a lot of this can be uh, handled through automation and handled through the system as folks go through and grant their approval. So now you don't have to get all of those groups together in a change advisory board, because throughout the process, you've grabbed their approvals at the appropriate times to put together. So I like trying to create lightweight processes that leverage the tools of the automation. Uh, but where this can come into play in the cloud environments, as we were talking about, separating accounts so that, you know, there's a little bit of friction there, that if somebody is working in day-to-day work and they also are somebody who, because they wear a lot of hats, has to go and make changes to add somebody to that distribution list, maybe they pivot and they log into their admin account, they do that, and then they come back to their email and whatnot. So establishing who is going to handle making changes at what times. Those roles of responsibility sort of it comes down to team norms a lot, which comes a lot of this comes back to culture. What are our team norms? So you may have somebody who's a backup, but they're not supposed to be making that change. But you need your team with their team norms to sort of respect that piece of it where, they're not gonna jump in and just make a change because they can, because somebody went directly to them and tapped them on the shoulder and whatnot, and the team has to be willing to push back. Um, and in really small business, I know you mentioned, ticketing systems aren't, you know, change management systems. And in really or small organizations, I've been able to use ticketing systems, like Jira to help with that through the careful addition of extra custom fields and labels to make sure we're capturing the right stuff within the tools that they already have without having to go out and buy more um, in that process. So, does that help at all? I know a lot of this wasn't specific to a cloud because it ends up being more just general process and culture based stuff, but I hope that was useful.
No, I think it's spot on. The change management is really a question of how much burden do you want to create on the change management process? Why are you creating that burden? And how do I streamline it? I think you answered it all exactly spot on. And just in terms of the choosing the ticketing tool, one place that does get interesting is when you're using a third-party MSP alongside internal IT. Oftentimes, internal IT doesn't have access to the same ticketing system that the external IP uses. So now you have a disparate system, and then those systems may not be company-wide. So there might be something that falls under IT. There might be something else that falls under facilities. They both need approval processes, but they need to have a common system because one thing I know about running a business is for every change that you make, it has at least a dozen downstream changes you didn't think about. So be really careful about adding one extra system. It's a lot more overhead. So I'm with you.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate you coming on the show and asking questions. This was great conversation. Our next caller on the show today is Adam from DC. Welcome to the show, Adam. It's great to have you here. How can we help you?
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So, our company is a Google Workspace shop, and the main way that we exchange data with our clients is through shared Google Drive folders and shared G Sheets. Our internal policy is that only people with email addresses on our domain, the client's domain, or the state government authoriser's domain can have access to those assets. The problem is, enforcement currently takes the form of me or the CTO manually approving or rejecting every share request. It works for now because we're a small company, but it's not sustainable. So, my question is, does Google Workspace have a way of restricting access to shared assets by email domain? If not, what are some best practices that we can implement while we're trying to automate permissions management?
That is a great question. There are ways to do that. It sounds like you're part way down that rabbit hole based on what you've told me. Um, there's an article on this that might be helpful that I'll make sure it finds its way over to you. But I know that this is one of those features that, and I know you're a Google Workspace shop. I know that this is one of those things that, in my opinion, Microsoft handles a little better. Google was built to be very collaborative. Um, I think that there are some things you can do to minimize that internally. One thing I would advise to lessen some of it is when you're sharing stuff internally, try to leverage group-based permissions instead of individual permissions. So add things to groups or sites, use, shared Google Drive folders, right? Instead of just putting things in individuals' drives. And that should reduce some of the administrative burden. But from an external perspective, I think you're more or less going to be stuck with that workflow you've got. um, Matt, I'll let you chime in if you know a specific exclusion to that. But what he's describing seems to match my understanding of how it works. Like I said, I'll get you a URL over that describes how to limit it. But it's a little gnarly, and I'm not sure it's going to do what you want. And also, too, I just want to add a little caveat onto that too. And I talked about this earlier in another discussion, but there can also be unintended consequences of this. Um, I mentioned before that I've seen this become a problem in environments, and it tends to be more of a problem in smaller environments. What happens is you'll end up locking things down too tightly, and then you'll end up with your users using shadow IT services to get around it, right? So if it becomes too difficult for them to collaborate with the people that they need to collaborate with to do their jobs, and you don't have the resources in place to block other things. For example, if you make it difficult for people to share things using Google Workspace, but there's nothing blocking them from, say, going out to Dropbox.com and creating a free personal account and just signing up with their personal Gmail, making an account and dropping the files in there and sharing them, that is almost certainly worse than them sharing folders from within your information boundary, right? So sometimes you have to tabletop this a little bit and just figure out what the least bad scenario is. Sometimes there's not a perfect solution, and you just have to rely on user education, continually reinforcing doing the right thing, and doing the best configuration that you can with the tool set that's available.
I think something else that you may be running into as well is just the fact that you've got a structure, maybe because of policy, where only certain people are able to approve these requests. Uh, and depending on the organization and how strict that policy is, and ability to maybe adjust the policy. Because again, if the policy is written one way, to do it a different way, you don't want to be in where you're violating the policy, but there may be a change that's necessary for the policy to allow delegation. Um, and so maybe this is one approach that I might look at in a situation like this is like, is there ability to an ability to assign data owners to other folks within the org based on certain types of data, and maybe they're responsible for approving certain certain requests, and so it's not global all the way up to only the top leadership, but you may have somebody who is accountable and responsible for this data here, and another person for those, and they field those requests. Maybe it doesn't all, maybe some things still come up to the top level, but maybe there's certain things that are uh, determined that they can be approved by somebody lower in certain some circumstances, meeting certain conditions, that they can do it, and then follow that with sort of an assurance process where maybe on a monthly basis a report is run for what are the things that are shared, who's it shared with, and then just review that report, or what are the things that were shared within the last month. So you're not maybe looking at everything, just the new shares, and that could potentially allow so a follow-up check, but you're trusting them to do what they need to do, and then you can check, on a monthly cadence, as similar to you doing access reviews and those types of things, um, that, most organizations should, be checking, making sure people have appropriate levels of access on regular basis. This could be part of that now, where you're checking to see if people have the appropriate level of access still, including some of these external folks. And, should that have been shared, should it not? And then if that gets worked in, you've got the ability to report and review and take action if something needs changed. But also you can spread the work around in the absence of being able to do this with automation with a specific tool or something.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. So, to your first point about kind of setting up those hierarchical boundaries, you should be able to accomplish that in Google Workspace using organizational units. You can set those up to create a hierarchy and apply policies based on that hierarchy. It is going to add a little bit of admin load to create and maintain those. And there is a tool native to Google Workspace that allows you to investigate sharing like that, but it's limited to a relatively small number of SKUs. So I don't know what SKUs you have, but I'll make sure that that tool gets in the show notes. and that we get a copy of the link over to you. And then you can see if that's available within your SKU or not. Unfortunately, I know that that's a little bit of a trend, and that's kind of um, the trade-off with SaaS. And I know I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, but sometimes the way to solve the problem is to pay for the fail.
Well, I really appreciate the answers. It's honestly good to know that using group level permissions, which is what we're doing, is on the right track. So thank you for the validation of what we're doing and just explain the limitations of the space.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming on the show, Adam. It's been great having you. Our last caller on the show today is Andy from Denver. Andy, welcome to the show. Looking forward to hearing your question. How can we help you?
Thanks for having me, guys. I want to ask about DLP in a small business environment. Knowing that most small businesses either don't have the funds or are not going to be willing to put out the funds to buy one of these big solutions, how can they solve for data loss and with as little friction to the end user and with as little noise to IT as possible?
So when you say data loss, I want to clarify this because it can mean different things to different people. Some people in some organizations, when they talk about this, they mean information being spread to unauthorized people inside or outside of the organization. In other circumstances, they mean the permanent loss of data owned by the organization. Which of those two definitions are you asking about, or both?
And both, but more so the generally inadvertent leakage of customer data and employee data, um, and predominantly unstructured data.
Yeah, this is something that's really difficult for SMBs. And so just first and foremost, I acknowledge the frustration of trying to solve this problem in the SMB space because both Microsoft and Google have structured their service offerings in such a way that the features that affect this aren't available until you get to um, at least the top tier of their SMB offerings. Um, and so, unfortunately, part of the solution is just pony up the money. I know no one really wants to hear that, but it is just the unfortunate reality of running SaaS is that um, sometimes there's features that you need and they're paywalled. Um, in the case of Microsoft 365, you would need to be at a business premium level to get the DLP features. In the case of Google Workspace, you would need to be at Business Plus, and those are both comparably priced. That said, both platforms usually have things that you can do to put some warnings around it. I know that Google tends to have some of that turned on by default. Well, they'll warn you if you're sending things out. The Microsoft 365 suite, in my opinion, has a little bit better functionality around this. Some of it is available without that advanced licensing, but um, one thing they do give you the ability to is to add it on to some additional SKUs, and they've been improving what SKUs you can add certain things onto. It can be really confusing which ones, though, especially on the Microsoft end. There's a site that I reference frequently called m365maps.com that lays out those feature matrices, and you can search for a specific feature that you're looking for, like DLP, and it'll tell you exactly what SKUs and what add-ons, and it'll show you what add-ons are available for what SKUs. And so that can be really helpful in figuring out how to do that. But unfortunately, I really don't have, other than upgrading to the paid DLP features, um, to mitigate it. On the other side of it, what's really important to understand in both of those environments is the difference between replication, retention, archival, and backup, right? And so they're pretty standard across both the Microsoft and Google Workspace products, where they're going to replicate the data across multiple data centers. That's going to give you high availability, right? They both typically have the ability to assign retention. That retention is going to vary based on your licensing level and based on what ecosystem you're in. I could probably do a whole 30-minute segment just on retention options across the different um, suites and SKUs, but I'm going to refrain from doing that in the sake of time. Um, and then, archival is again going to be different. Typically, archival is going to be using some third-party tool, and you usually accomplish that with what's called journaling, and that's typically out to a third-party service. You would journal out. Usually, it comes along with a secure email gateway product. Some people have on-prem appliances that they journal to, but that essentially saves a copy, and that's really usually not a backup, right? And then the final thing is actually data backup, and there's native tools. I don't generally like using native tools to back up SaaS data. Um, Both Google and Microsoft 365 will give you some native tools to do it. I typically recommend that people spend a little bit of money and put in a third party solution because I just can't shake the feeling. And this applies to cloud infrastructure as well, right? So you could apply this same advice to, say, using, AWS backup in AWS. Well, if you're backing up data and it lives in the same system and the same account that it originated from, it's kind of like just keeping the backup on the server. Yeah, you got another copy of your data, but is it separate enough? For me, not usually. You have to understand what your risk appetite is. It might be okay for you. You have to understand, you know, what kind of data loss is acceptable to you? How much data can you lose? How likely are you to lose it? There are a lot of good solutions out there for backing those up. I mentioned it before, but OffPoint has a solution for both products to both get some insights into DLP and to provide backup. There are more options for data backup in the Microsoft 365 suite than there are in Google Workspace. Also understand that both of them are going to have at least a first stage recycle bin. So even when you delete data, it's going to get what's called soft deleted, right? And how long it stays in that soft deleted state and whether you can restore it without an administrative action is going to vary based on the suite and the tool, right? So you're, for example, restoring a file from Google Drive is going to vary from a Google Workspace mailbox, and similarly, restoring a file deleted from a SharePoint document library is going to be wildly different than removing it from your first stage recycle bin in a user's OneDrive. It's really just going to vary, and you're going to need to look at that. But there's a lot that goes into it, and you really just need to understand your risk and your timeline.
Yeah, and you mentioned noise. I picked up on that word because there is pain that comes with these particular kinds of tools, these data loss prevention tools that are watching for certain, for listeners that may not be familiar with DLP or data loss prevention tools. These tools are watching for that data to be accessed in ways that it's not supposed to be accessed, from places it's not supposed to be accessed, leaving your environment, those types of things, to make sure that your team members are not handling the data improperly, but also to make sure that maybe an attacker isn't in the system and also trying to exfiltrate this data and send it out to somewhere where now they have control over it to, leak it, or, whatever they're going to do to try and extort the company, or, any number of things that they may want to do. Uh, but it takes quite a bit of tuning. You put these things in and they are noisy. And it's very difficult to tune them if the company hasn't already done some kind of fundamental pre-work first. And so when I'm working with clients, DLP is usually sort of a future state thing, because in order to get there, we've got to look at data classifications and data inventory, and understand, like, what data do we have? What is the classification and sensitivity of these? How do we need to treat them differently? How should they be handled differently? And once you know that data, then you can create the rules in the DLP system to watch for those particular types of data. So that could be credit card numbers. It watches for certain data that fits a certain pattern, or social security numbers, or something like that. But it could also be larger pieces of data. The patterns can vary in size that it's watching for. Uh, but getting there is very difficult if you haven't done that pre-work. So in a lot of small businesses, using the tools in M365 and Google Workspace is generally where I try to get them to over a period of time, uh, and you turn those on. But if you don't do the tuning, what generally happens with these tools, especially if you don't have the time to invest to get them configured, you turn it on, it gets noisy, you set up a rule that sends those alerts to some other mailbox or something, and they never get looked at again, and they're done with it. So this is another area. I know I suggested earlier on some of the cloud security review stuff, getting these dialed in. If there is a real business driver to turn on the DLP features in your business, small business owners especially, like this is an area where that special domain knowledge and having somebody who's done this before to help is really, really useful. So this is another area where it's probably good to talk to somebody to have them look and help you configure it and tune it uh, based on the specific kinds of data that you're worried about and the specific locations of that data, where it may be and where it's supposed to be and where you don't want it to be, those types of things, and help you get it set up so that it's not a noisy, annoying mess that just makes you want to just turn it completely off and say, forget it, I don't need that. And, you know, in the long run, uh, it does make you less secure. So, it's good to approach that particular one with sort of a mindful process to step through it. Otherwise, it is painful.
Yeah, and to validate, I'll share a story from an environment that this was a mid-sized business, and they had even implemented a very good SIM and had good coverage, but they didn't go through the effort to tune it. And what happened at this place was they were getting a regular alert that was being triggered over a large data exfiltration event. And when I came into the environment, I saw this alert firing. I said, "Hey, I'm seeing this alert. This is concerning. We should look into this." And they said, "You know, that happens all the time. And what we think it is that we have this one machine and it runs a process." And I've got to be vague here to protect confidentiality, but they said, "We've got this machine and it runs this process. It produces a large data set, and that data set is then sent off site for analysis. It's like a 50 gig upload, and this alert fires every time it does that." I said, "Well, we should really tune the SIM to make that alert not fire from that source to that destination if we know that it's good." They said, "Yeah, it's just not a priority. We can't get to it." And so it kept firing and it kept firing, and everything was fine until it wasn't. And turns out that they had this story is going to sound familiar because it happens all the time. They had a VPN that was unpatched, that did not require MFA. It was breached. A threat actor got in and dumped an entire MS SQL database out to the dark web. And yes, it turns out that the alert fired when the attacker dumped the SQL database, but because they had normalized that noise, they didn't get the early warning. And they could have contained the blast radius and limited lateral spread, but the opportunity was lost. And this is a phenomenon that's not exclusive to IT or cybersecurity. It's known as normalization of deviance. And if you Google that term, you'll find a lot of stories about normalization of deviance. The most notable one is the Challenger disaster, where we lost the shuttle and all of the people that were inside of it. And it turns out that this is a story that even happens in engineering, where there was a gasket and it was returning a suboptimal spec, but it had always been that way and nothing bad happened, so they didn't do anything about it. And so that noise can be really dangerous, because when you get that noise and you don't tune it, then you normalize it, and then you become blind to real threats that can cause you damage.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate you coming on the show and asking a question. This was a great topic. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, guys.
So, Anthony, we've had several callers on the show with great questions and good discussion here. Any sort of, final thoughts or key takeaways that you want to, point out or reiterate for the listeners?
Yeah, I think so. There were a couple themes that it would be good to just to put a point on at the end, and I think one of them is that security is not a point in time exercise. It's got to be ongoing. You have to be reviewing these things on a regular basis. At a minimum, sit down and whatever your security review process is, take a look at that at least on an annual basis. If your organization has the ability to do it, I know Matt and I both strongly recommend engaging with some outside expertise. People who review these environments for a living are going to be able to give you insights that are difficult to come by on your own because of the value of experience they've had in multiple environments. They're able to identify trends and help bring those trends to you and bring you quicker value without you having to learn the lesson the hard way. Um, so there's a lot of help out there. There's a lot of good resources. Both Microsoft and Google provide a ton of great documentation. It can be very long. The Center for Internet Security has a ton of great documentation on securing Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. And anything that you can do to get some more observability into your environment is always good. There's native ways to do this in both Microsoft or Google, or you can use any high quality SIM product.
Cloud services, especially for small businesses, are amazing because they allow the business owner or the business leaders to focus on the business's core competency and not be running an IT shop. They're not worrying about infrastructure. They're not worrying about all the software, and they're able to use the tools and build processes that use those tools to get work done and help drive their business forward. And so I'm a huge proponent of cloud tools. Uh, but with that great power comes great responsibility. It's a little cliche.
I've been resisting using that exact quote
Yes.
this whole time. So I'm glad that somebody said it because I was
Yes.
trying not to.
The flexibility, everything these things offer, but they can't be everything to everybody. And the manufacturers, the publishers, they're not manufacturing software. This is interesting. I'm not sure what word to use here. I guess the publishers, the service providers, um, in this case, are trying to make this stuff for a mass market. And with that, you just have to be mindful that there is a little bit of work you got to do for securing it, but that you're not alone. You don't have to go this alone. There are great checklists available and frameworks available, and there's help in the form of professionals, like Anthony, that can come and help you do these things. Like take a look at your configurations and make sure that you're set correctly and that it's configured the way you're expecting it to be configured as well, because these settings don't always behave the way you think they're going to behave uh, as well. So the cost is always very important in small businesses, but it's not necessarily cost prohibitive to get expertise on sort of an on-demand basis in just small bits and pieces when you're not looking at hiring full-time IT people, when you're looking at hiring an expert to come in and support you for a few hours. Uh, it can work very, very well and can help make sure that you're set up right to keep your business protected. So, I huge fan of cloud.
I agree. It's really such a force multiplier. And your point about, even small business owners being able to deploy this, if you just think about how much business and economic growth that's enabled, it wasn't that long ago that you really couldn't do this on your own. As a business owner, the thought of going out and buying a server, setting up Active Directory, deploying Exchange, deploying SharePoint, figuring out how to network all of your workstations and set up user identities, it was very daunting. And cloud services and cloud SaaS have really democratized this and just made it available to every business of every scale. There's a lot of options if you're a very small business or if you're a nonprofit that are worth exploring, that can help you get access to affordable licensing, and even in some cases free if you're in the nonprofit sector. So, definitely look into those and figure out how to get the best deal for your business as well.
Where can folks find you online? We're going to put links and stuff that we mentioned into the show description here. But if folks want to follow up with you, follow you somewhere or ask questions, where do you recommend folks go to find you online?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. That's where I'm the most active. I'll make sure there's a link to my profile. I'll have both personal page. It's easy to find. It's Anthony Peyton. And there's a page, Conflux Cloud. That's Conflux Cloud. I've made those URLs pretty easy. And then we also have a website, confluxcloud.tech.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate you coming on the show. This has been another fantastic episode. I'm excited to get this one queued up and into the feed here soon. And thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our callers. We wouldn't have a show if I didn't have callers, and I wouldn't need to make a show if we didn't have listeners. We do this for you. So thank you for listening, especially if you're still listening. I really do appreciate it. I am Accidental CISO, and until next time, stay mindful.
Don't miss our next episode. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app and follow us on social media. Visit Focivity.com/podcast. That's FOCIVITY.com/podcast for show information and links to our social media pages. This has been the Mindful Business Security Show, brought to you by Focivity.